The Pathans by Olaf Caroe. Sakas, Kushans and Persians. Chapter 5. The Sakas, diverted by their Parthian cousins from Iran, are shown by numismatic study to have arrived in Gandhara at the beginning of the 1st century BC and to have ruled for about 100 years, up to AD 5. Coins show the names of 4 Saka rulers: Maves, Azis I, Azilises, and Azis II, the Greek Zeta, as in Bazira, standing for a Y. The Saka eruption seems to have passed through the gap in the east-west ranges where Herat is situated to occupy the former Achaemenian satrapies of Drangiana and Arachosia, to the first of which they gave the name of Sakistan. Their presence in Arachosia, as far north as Ghazni, is attested by numerous coins, and coins also indicate their entry onto the plains of what is now Pakistan by way of the Gumal, Tochi and Paiwa routes. Some of them reached Gandhara from the south, coming up the Indus from the direction of Baluchistan and Sindh, into which they had penetrated after their defeat at Parthian hands further west. The thrust towards the Punjab was led by Mavs between 97 and 77 BC. Their dramatic progress was no doubt aided by their pioneering of a new form of warfare, based upon an armoured cavalry force, whose chief weapon was a long lance known to the Romans as the contus. Saka methods of war were indeed known much earlier than this. Arrian describes how their shock tactics first came to notice on the Persian side at Gaugamela, where all Alexander's prowess was needed to turn the fortunes of the day. Maves established his capital at Taxila, where the Greco-Bactrians had been before him. After his death, there was an interval during which various Saka tribes contended for mastery for some 20 years, and no leader emerged until Azis I in 58 BC re-established authority and inaugurated the Saka era, which begins in that year. This contest between lesser men when the great man dies demonstrates the tribal inability to coordinate effective action in the absence of a trusted leader, and has many parallels in later Pathan history. We may well surmise that the Saka heritage in these parts is not confined to the linguistic. Azis I established a flourishing and powerful kingdom, distinguished by a numerous silver coinage betokening a long reign. He was succeeded by his son and grandson, Azilises and Azis II, the coinage becoming debased about AD 5 when a new dynasty, the Parthians, succeeded to power in this region. From Greek historians and Persian inscriptions, we know that, like their Parthian cousins, the Sakas were splendid horsemen and had a great reputation as dashing warriors. Greek vases represent them as hairy men with heavy, bushy beards. A Roman commentator describes the Alani, one of the Scythian clans, as men of great stature and beauty and of a fair colour. The important part they played in the Persian army is clear from Herodotus and Arrian, and numerous coins minted after their conquests in Sakistan, Sistan, the frontier region and northwestern India illustrate both their panoply and their tactics as fighting men. The inscription on the lion capital from Mathura in India, now in the British Museum, indicates their veneration for a leader in whom they trusted. It seems to have been carved in commemoration of the funeral ceremonies of a king, possibly Maves. It may generally be said that theirs is a history peculiarly dependent on the results of numismatic effort, for the dates of their kings and the course of the movements of their armies are deducible mainly from coin discoveries from different mints. The so-called Indo-Parthian kingdom, which for a short 70 years attained power on the frontier after the Sakas, represented a shift of emphasis rather than a conquest. For these Parthians, like their Saka cousins, were of Central Asian nomadic stock, and their accession meant only a stronger assertion of Parthian power from the west. By the year AD 5, the Arsacid Parthian dynasty of Ctesiphon had attained to the summit of its power, and the extension of its authority to the Indus at this period was no doubt prompted by a determination to re-establish Persian imperial rule to the furthest limits of the former Achaemenian dominion. This operation appears to have been conducted by the Sakistan-Sistan route and is associated with the name of the Surin family, the mightiest of all the Arsacid vassal chiefs. By AD 19, one Gondophares, a member of this family, is shown by an inscription at Takhti Bahi to be ruling over Gandhara and the northern Punjab. It is probable that Gondophares enjoyed some measure of local autonomy, while acknowledging the suzerainty of the Arsacids in their faraway capital of Ctesiphon on the Tigris. This is the king mentioned by name in an apocryphal Acts of the Apostles describing the missionary endeavours of the Apostle Thomas in the Indus region. We cannot here turn to examine the truth of that tale, but it is interesting that the dates fit. Gondophares died in AD 48, and there can be no possible collusion between a Takhti Bahi inscription and an apocryphal Christian book. These Parthians of the Surin family were men of great splendour, if indeed, along with their Saka cousins, they contributed to the Pathan make-up. They bequeathed something magnificent. The feudal lords furnished the heavy cavalry with iron armour, known as cataphracti, and the lesser nobility, the light cavalry, the Sagittarii, for which the Parthian armies were famous. The undaunted Parthian, with his arrows and swift progress, is celebrated in the Odes of Horace, and the picture of the horseman shooting over his shoulder as he retired is familiar. Greek and Roman descriptions of the Battle of Caroe in 53 BC give a fine account of the cloud of dust on the horizon, opening to reveal the Surin bodyguard of 1,000 mailed horsemen, which charged down on the Roman infantry, unused to shock tactics from heavily armed cavalry. The new arm is described with the awe accorded in our day to the invention of armoured vehicles. The legions were cut to pieces, and Roman ambitions beyond the Euphrates perished, not to rise again. Caroe was one of the world's decisive battles, and it was won by men whose grandsons established themselves on the northwest frontier. It is worth noting, too, that the Surin family survived the fall of the Arsacid dynasty and the rise of the Sasanians of Persia under Ardashir, about AD 225. But the Parthian dynasty on the eastern frontier failed to make good and fell about AD 75 to yet another horde from beyond the Oxus, the Kushans. These defeated Gondophares' successor in a fierce battle right under the walls of Taxila, of which recent excavations afford good evidence. Archaeologists have traced a breach in the walls of Sirkap, the Taxila city, and many arrowheads. It seems that from this date, Taxila was destroyed as a city. The later sculptural and other artistry discovered there comes not from Sirkap, but from the Buddhist monasteries in the foothills north and east of the city. On their way south, the Kushans had attacked and greatly weakened the Parthian Empire of the Arsacids, which was under simultaneous pressure from the Rome of the Caesars in the west. Their first conquest was Bactria, south of the Oxus, whence, under their first ruler of note, Kujula Kadphises, they organised advances south, east and west, which in due course gave them an immense empire covering not only the whole of what was then eastern Iran, modern Afghanistan, and Pakistan as far east as the Indus, but the Punjab and the India of the Ganges Valley as far as Allahabad or Benares. It is probable that Kujula himself, having first made himself master of the Kabul Valley, annexed Gandhara as far as the Indus about AD 60, conquering it from the successor of the Parthian Gondophares. The decisive battle giving him mastery of what was then northern India was the siege and storm of Taxila some 15 years later, the victor being either a nameless successor or Cadphises II, known from the coins as Wima Cadphises. The sway of Wima extended to the mouth of the Indus, and he profited from the weakness of the Parthians, engaged with Rome, to seize the whole of modern Afghanistan, then Arya, Sakistan, and Arachosia. Wima was succeeded by the greatest of the Kushan monarchs, the famous Kanishka, whose succession starts a new era. Under Kanishka, the Kushan Empire was extended far into the Ganges Valley, and a capital city of the Indian province was established at Mathura. The actual date of his succession is disputed among scholars, with variations of opinion. The latest scholars fix the Kanishka era as starting in the second quarter of the second Christian century, possibly AD 128, some 500 years before the Hijrat. His northern capital was at the central point of the empire, Purushapura, or Peshawar. So once again, we have come home. The ethnic stock of the Kushans is in some dispute, and a considerable body of opinion has maintained that, while their subjects were Iranian in the western part of their dominion and Indian in the east, they themselves were an early wave of Hun or Turk affinity. Others, including Gershman and McGovern, are firm in holding them to be yet another horde of Scythians, and this I accept as the more authoritative view. They are known to Chinese records as the Yue Qi, of whom the Guishang or Kushan were the leading clan. Excavation and numismatic study reveal that the original religious background of the Kushans was a Mazdian fire worship, of which traces remain even in the monuments they left in their new homes along the Indus. But when they reached the Indus Valley, they became subject to many religious influences, the first effect of which was to produce a syncretism so tolerant that its niches received deities as varied as Heracles, Hephaestus, Mithras, Shiv, and finally, the Lord Buddha. It was down this broad path of eclectic experiment that the great Kushan king Kanishka proceeded, to find in the end that Buddhist revelation caused him to displace the other gods from their pedestals and to offer devotion to the form of worship now associated with Gandhara and the Kushan age. Kanishka, having chosen Gandhara, with its capital Peshawar as the nodal point of his empire, the state he ruled has come to be known as the Kingdom of Gandhara. Since Kanishka, following in the footsteps of Asoka 4 centuries earlier, had embraced or at least greatly encouraged Buddhism, and Gandhara, under his leadership, became the centre of an important civilization, especially with regard to art. The name has come to be used in designation of the significant art forms which spread outward from Peshawar to many other parts of Asia. It was because under Kanishka there had developed a golden age of Buddhism that the Chinese pilgrims, Faxian and Huenzhang, later made it one of the bournes of their pilgrimage. Outside the Ganj Gate of modern Peshawar city was discovered in 1909 the remarkable relic casket of Kanishka, now deposited in the Peshawar Museum. The site of these excavations is now locally known as Shaji Kaderi, the King's Mound. The difficulty of reconstructing Kushan history arises from the fact that their main contacts extended to the inhabitants of India, the least imbued with a historical sense of any ancient civilization in the world. Relatively to the size and scope of the empire, little contemporary evidence is available, and though the later Chinese Buddhist literature records legends of Kanishka, these books do not fill in accurate historical detail and are largely repetitions of Indian religious speculation. Moreover, the records which do exist throw little light on the tribes and people in the Gandhara region over whom Kanishka and his successors ruled. Coins and works of art are innumerable, and from them the dynastic overtones may be painted in. But for the identity, or way of life, or language of the ruled, we look in vain. Only the name of the capital is known, of the Paktus, the Aparutai, the Gandharioi and their successors, we have no word. We do not even know for certain of what stock the rulers themselves claim to be. This is a pity, for it is only under the Kushans that Peshawar attained the dignity of an imperial capital. It was under the Kushans that the channels of trade between the Roman world and further Asia were at last unblocked. Ever since the Seleucids had yielded power to the Arsacids on the Iranian plateau, the state described by Sir Mortimer Wheeler as the implacable barrier of Parthia had stood astride these routes, often at war with Rome, and closing the Orient trade by extortionate levy or actual veto. But the rise of the Kushan power on her eastern flank involved Parthia in a war on 2 fronts. Iran, as Gershman observes, had become a much reduced central state sandwiched between Rome and a new empire based on Gandhara. The Kushans and the Romans had a common interest, both in politics and in commerce. The Kushans, now holding stretches of the east-west trade routes, were able to divert merchandise to avoid Parthian territory. And it was from this time that the Parthian period of decadence set in. We may follow Tarn in his conviction that Gandhara art would never have been brought to birth had not Greek kings ruled in that country in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. But it is now more generally held that it is to this age, the age of Kanishka, AD 128 to 151, 200 years later, that we must attribute the full flowering of the famous Gandhara art in sculpture, in stone, bronze and stucco, in coffers, plaques, bowls and ol/etdar of all descriptions. This astonishing mass of material represents, according to Wheeler, not a Greek influence as such, but the most penetrating and enduring impact of the Roman upon the Eastern world. The craftsmen may often have been Greeks, but the source of this plethora of art treasures has been traced to Roman Alexandria. By the absorption of the Western modes of expression, in the representation of figure statuary and so on, the face of Buddhism was changed. The Hinayana, or lesser vehicle, expanded into the Mahayana, or greater vehicle. Under the former, the Buddha was never represented. He was not a god, but a sage. Under the Mahayana, a persuasion which first took shape under Kanishka and is represented by the art of Gandhara, the Buddha has become divine and is the focus of every composition. The Roman heroic and funerary art is indeed transmuted by the Oriental craftsman and given a Buddhist context, but, as Wheeler points out, both iconographically and aesthetically, the change was revolutionary and represents a synthesis of the utmost interest and importance. As to the controversy on the point of whether this new effulgence should be linked with Greece or with Rome, it is possible to hold that in this region it is perhaps unreal to make a distinction between the two sources of influence. It is generally agreed that the fountainhead of inspiration was Alexandria, the centre of Neoplatonism and Hellenistic art, whether under the Graceized Ptolemies or the Romans who succeeded them. Admitting that Gandhara art was the outcome of Kushan commerce bringing in the craftsmanship of the Roman Empire, it is worth remembering that the time now assigned for it coincided with the reign of the Emperor Hadrian, AD 117 to 138, a devotee of esoteric cults and the arts who spoke Greek better than Latin. It is certain, too, that the craftsmen employed stood for an Eastern Mediterranean rather than a Latin tradition. We may follow Tarn at least so far as to believe that the earlier Greco-Bactrian kingdom in Gandhara had paved the way for this development. In King Kanishka's later days, when he had become a fervent Buddhist, he created a great relic tower, probably just outside the Ganj Gate of Peshawar at Shaji Kideri, with a superstructure of carved wood rising in 13 stories to a height of some 400 feet and surmounted by an iron pinnacle. Vincent Smith tells us how it was visited by Sung Yun, a Chinese pilgrim at the beginning of the 6th century, by which time it had thrice been destroyed by fire and as often rebuilt by pious kings. A monastery of exceptional magnificence was still flourishing here as a place of Buddhist education as late as the 9th century, when it was visited by Viradeva, an eminent Buddhist scholar. But the Brahminical revival, which began in the later Kushan period, frowned on Buddhist piety, and what was left by the Brahmins seems to have been finally destroyed by Mahmud of Ghazni and his successors in the 11th century. It is a strange reflection that Peshawar, the seat of learning which gave birth to a religion that gloried in the portrayal of life in pictorial art, later became one of the spiritual centres of the faith which is distinguished for iconoclasm. We have collected evidence to suggest that tribes bearing names which have come down to the present day were already living in the neighbourhood of Peshawar many centuries before the Kushan renaissance of Buddhism, and that the ancestor of the language now spoken in this region had already come in certainly no later than the Saka horsemen. The Kushans themselves a fresh wave of Saka invaders of Iranian stock must have spoken a language not so very different from that of the Sakas. In a word, there is evidence that the Paktu speakers of today, or their progenitors, were beginning to emerge when Kanishka was king. How could our ancestors have been followers of the image of Buddha? A Pathan of today would ask. It is not difficult to supply some sort of answer. A new wind may blow, and ancient fragrances grow stale. The very strength of a Pathan's reaction against the sensuous rituals of the older creeds may be indicative of his ancestors' feeling for those rituals in their day. Guftaguyi kafawadin, akir bikuja mikashad, kwab yak kwab ast, bashad mukhtalif taberha. This chatter of heathendom and faith, where does it lead in the end? The dream is one dream, though many and various be the interpretations. After the Kushans, there is yet one more Iranian dynasty which ruled in Gandhara before the advent of fresh hordes from Central Asia. This was the Sasanians. On the latest reckoning, Kanishka, emperor of the Kushans, died about AD 151 and was succeeded by three of his line, Vasishka, Huvishka, and Vasudeva, whose reign terminated about AD 225. The evidence of sculpture and coins shows that, until near the end, the influence of Buddhism went deep, but the strongly Hindu flavour of the last king's name, Vasu, is a variant of Vishnu, and Deva speaks for itself, indicates a beginning or possibly a revival of Brahminical influence over the court. There is a contemporary passage in the Agni Purana indicating that Hindu ideologists of the time saw in Kushan conversion to Buddhism a danger to the survival of the state. A creed such as Buddhism, advocating non-violence and self-negation, could hardly ensure the power of a military people like the Kushans, ruling by right of conquest, and was bound to have far-reaching political repercussions. The passage, quoted thinly, veils a sneer at invaders whose military prowess had been so undermined, and it is probable that the acceptance of Hinduism by the last recorded Kushan was a belated endeavour to return to the Brahminical fold. There can be little doubt that, as with the Mauryas, an over-fervent Buddhism contributed to the military failure of the Kushans in the 3rd century. Conversion to a more realistic Brahmanism had come too late. The overthrow of the Kushans was brought about by the new and great power which had arisen in Persia proper, the Sasanians. Not for the first or the last time, it is impossible to understand the history of Gandhara, so often an eastern frontier of Persia, without turning to the fountainhead in Persia itself. Ardashir, the grandson of Sasan, a temple dignitary at Shtakar, was a true Persian of Fars or Persis, regarding himself as in the legitimate line from the Achaemenids more than 5 centuries before. Uniting the minor princes of Fars under his rule, he overcame Artabanus, Ardavan, the last Arsacid of the Parthian line, and was crowned king in AD 226. In AD 240, he was succeeded by his son Shapur, who, as crown prince, had worked in double harness with his father. Between them, Ardashir and Shapur made the power of Persia feared as it had not been since the days of Caroe. They turned their attention first to the destruction of the Kushan Empire, which, in collusion with Rome, had been such a menace to Persia under the Arsacids. Subsequently, Shapur moved against Rome and defeated and captured the Roman Emperor Valerian himself on the field of Edessa, AD 260. This is the King Shapur whose inscription we have already noticed, engraved on the walls of the fire temple at Nakshi Rustam near Persepolis, the inscription recording Peshawar as the eastern limit of the Persian Empire. It was engraved at some date between AD 260, the Edessa victory which it commemorates, and AD 273, the date of Shapur's death. Kanishka's Kushan dynasty was replaced by a line of princes recognizing Persian suzerainty and ruling over a greatly reduced kingdom which may have been confined to the Kabul Valley and Gandhara. The precise date of the supersession of the Kushans by the Sasanians in Gandhara is not clear, but the last Vasudeva inscription is assigned to AD 226, agreeing exactly with the date of commencement of the Sasanian era. It seems likely then that Peshawar was captured by Ardashir about AD 230, before the succession of Shapur. Like the Arsacids before them, the Sasanian dynasty of Persia endured for over 4 centuries. It did not give way until the last Shahinshah, Yazgird III, was overcome by the Arabs at Nihavand in AD 642 and, like Darius Kodamanus, the last Achaemenian, fled eastward to Merv to meet death at the hand of an assassin. His empire crumbled as had that of Darius, and its western portions were absorbed into the caliphate. But that is to anticipate, and we must look again to Peshawar and the east. The eastern boundary of the Sasanian Empire did not extend beyond the Indus. The Punjab and the Gangetic portions of the Kushan kingdom remained for a time under Kushan rulers, and eventually, in the larger part, were absorbed in the Hindu kingdom of the Guptas. That portion of the Kushan kingdom which fell to the Sasanians embraced Gandhara, the Derajat and Sindh, as well as large parts of Afghanistan, and was known as Kushan Shah. Its ruler was always the leading Sasanian noble, after the Shahinshah himself with the title of Kushan Shah, much as after Victoria, the British sovereign was entitled Emperor of India. There is reason to believe that the first Kushan Shah was Shapur I himself, as heir apparent to his father Ardashir, and during his father's lifetime. More than one of the later rulers of the Sasanian eastern frontier was the crown prince in person. This arrangement continued until about AD 365, when the Sasanian eastern provinces temporarily collapsed under fresh pressures from the north, brought about by the movements of the White Huns. With one exception, there is no reference under the Sassanids, any more than under their predecessors, to the ethnic or linguistic makeup or the state of civilization of the peoples on their eastern frontier. The one-pointer is the first apparent use of the designation Afghan. Significantly enough, this, like the reference to Peshawar, appears in the inscription of Shapur I at Nakshi Rustam, which mentions a certain Gundifer Abgan Rizmaud. The second word can hardly be other than an early form of Afghan, an identification which can be supported by the reflection that the Shahinshah must have had many East Iranian retainers. According to Sprengling, a similar name, Apakan, occurs as the designation of the later Sasanian emperor Shapur III, who reigned for 70 years, AD 309 to 379. Phonetically, the evolution from Abgan to Apakan to Afghan is normal enough, and it is tempting to see in these Sasanian chiefs ancestors of the Afghan tribes proper, the Yusufzai or the Durrani. The Sasanians are not yet finished, but it took them the best part of 200 years to stage a comeback to Gandhara. There was now to occur a new and much more overwhelming invasion, compared to which previous struggles for power fade into the background and seem little more than dynastic rivalry.